My name is Brady Coleman. I'm 34 years old. My wife texted me at 11:47 p.m. to tell me she wasn't coming home. 6 weeks earlier, she'd done the same thing. Same excuse. Same handful of words typed out like she'd rehearsed them. Don't wait up. I'm staying at Tyler's. This time she didn't bother explaining who Tyler was. She didn't have to. I'd known for a while. I thought that text was the worst thing I'd read all night. I was wrong. Because around 1 in the morning, still awake, still staring at the ceiling in a bed that felt too big, I opened her old laptop. The one she never used anymore. The one that still auto-logged into everything. Looking for nothing in particular. What I found instead was a message thread between her and Courtney, her best friend since college, that had nothing to do with me at all. Until it did. But here's what Whitney didn't know yet. While she'd been packing her overnight bag for Tyler's place, I'd already been packing something else. Somewhere in this story there's a locksmith's van parked in our driveway, and by the time she saw it, it was already too late to matter. Welcome to my channel, where I tell the stories people usually only tell one person, years later, over a beer they didn't finish. We talk about marriages that looked fine from the outside and weren't. 7 years earlier, none of this would have made sense to either of us. Whitney and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Boise, back when she was finishing her nursing degree and I was 2 years into a job I still liked. She had this laugh that filled up a room before you even knew what the joke was, and I remember thinking, on our third date, that I'd never met anyone who made ordinary things, grocery runs, bad movies, sitting in traffic, feel like they were worth doing together. We got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard, small, a little chaotic, exactly what she wanted. Nora came 4 years after that, and for a while, I thought we'd built something solid. Not perfect. Solid. If I'm honest, though, and I've had a long time to be honest with myself about this, there were always small threads I chose not to pull. Whitney had dated Tyler Brandt for 3 years in college, on and off, the kind of relationship people describe as complicated when they mean it never fully ended, it just stopped being official. She talked about him sometimes, early on, in the easy way people talk about their past when it doesn't feel dangerous yet. I never loved hearing his name. I never said anything either. That was me. Then, and mostly still, I don't push. I let things sit until they either resolve themselves or don't. They reconnected on Facebook the spring Nora turned 4, in one of those alumni groups Whitney rarely checked. She mentioned it once, in passing, over dinner. Tyler's back in town. Isn't that random? And I said something forgettable back, and we moved on to talking about Nora's preschool waitlist. I didn't think about it again for months. I should have. By that summer, Whitney was picking up extra shifts at the hospital that didn't always match the schedule taped to our fridge. She started keeping her phone face down on the counter, a habit she'd never had before, and when it buzzed, she'd glance at it the way you glance at something you're hoping no one else noticed buzz. I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't ask. There was a night in July I still think about, not because anything happened, but because of what didn't. She came home late from a girls' night, smelling like a restaurant I didn't recognize, and I was sitting up with Nora, who'd had a nightmare, and Whitney kissed my forehead on her way to check on our daughter, and I remember thinking, clear as anything, something is different about her. Not guilty, exactly. Lighter. Like she'd been somewhere she didn't want to leave. I didn't say a word. I told myself I was imagining it, that 7 years of marriage made a man paranoid over nothing, that trusting my wife wasn't naivety. It was the whole point of choosing her in the first place. That's the story I told myself for the better part of a year. It's not entirely untrue. It's also not the whole truth, and there's a difference between those two things I didn't understand yet. Courtney started coming around more that fall, which should have felt normal, since she and Whitney had been close since their 20s, but something about the timing sat wrong in a way I couldn't name. The two of them would go quiet when I walked into a room mid-conversation. Not dramatically. Just a beat too long. A subject changed a half-second too fast. I filed it away with everything else I wasn't looking at directly. By the time Whitney started staying out overnight, twice now, both times at Tyler's, both times delivered to me over text instead of in person, like she'd decided somewhere along the way that I didn't warrant a conversation. I wasn't shocked so much as I was finally paying attention to something I'd been avoiding for the better part of a year. I sat at our kitchen table that night with her laptop open in front of me, Nora's nightlight glowing down the hall, and read through a message thread between my wife and her best friend that made it very clear exactly how long I'd been the last person in this arrangement to know anything. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I closed the laptop, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I stopped waiting to see what would happen next and started deciding what I was going to do about it. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I read that message thread once, closed the laptop, and didn't open it again for 6 days. Not because I didn't want to know more, because I already knew enough, and some part of me wasn't ready to let the rest of my life catch up to what I'd just learned. That's the thing about me. I've always been better at absorbing bad news quietly than doing anything about it in the moment. Whitney used to call it my superpower, back when it looked like patience instead of what it actually was. "You never freak out," she said once, half admiring, half something else I didn't examine closely enough at the time. She wasn't wrong. I didn't freak out. I just filed things away, over and over, until the drawer got too full to close. The Tuesday after I read the messages, Whitney came home from her shift and kissed me like nothing had changed, because as far as she knew, nothing had. She talked about a patient who'd made her laugh, asked about Nora's day, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat across from me at the table where I'd read her secrets 6 nights earlier. I asked how work was. She said fine. I said good. That's how most of that week went. Ordinary on the surface. Underneath it, I was watching everything differently now. Not snooping. Not yet. Just noticing with a kind of clarity I hadn't let myself have before. Her phone stayed face down. That wasn't new. What was new was how fast she'd reach for it when it buzzed during dinner, glance at the screen, and set it back down without comment. 3 times that week. 3 times I didn't ask who it was. Nora started asking about Mommy's friend Tyler, that Thursday, out of nowhere, the way kids drop things that adults have been carefully not saying out loud. We were building a puzzle on the living room floor, and she said, "Is Tyler coming to my birthday party?" I asked her where she'd heard that name. She shrugged. "Mommy said it on the phone." I didn't press her further. I didn't have to. I already knew who Tyler was. I called my brother Marcus that weekend, mostly to hear a voice that wasn't part of any of this. We talked about nothing for 20 minutes, his fantasy football team, our dad's knee surgery, and then, almost without meaning to, I said, "Would you tell me if you thought something was wrong with my marriage?" He went quiet for a second too long. "Why, is something wrong?" I said I didn't know yet. He didn't push. Marcus never pushes either. It runs in the family, apparently, this particular way of loving people from a careful distance. If you've ever noticed something wrong and told yourself you were being paranoid, just to buy one more ordinary evening before everything changed, I think you already know what that week felt like for me. What I didn't know yet was how much further it was going to go before I let myself act on any of it. Courtney came by that Sunday while Whitney was at the grocery store, ostensibly to drop off a serving dish from a dinner party months earlier. She stood in our kitchen making small talk, and for the first time, I watched her the way I'd started watching everything else, closely, without letting it show. She asked about Nora's preschool. She asked about my job. She never once asked about Whitney, which struck me as strange for 2 women who talked or texted almost daily. When she left, she hugged me a beat longer than usual at the door and said, "You're a good guy, Brady," in a tone that had something underneath it I couldn't place at the time. I thanked her. I didn't understand yet that it had sounded almost like an apology. The credit card statement came that week too, the way it did every month, and I sat with it at the kitchen table after Whitney had gone to bed. Most of it was normal: groceries, gas, Nora's dance class. But there was a charge from a wine bar downtown, a Thursday night, $94, the same night she'd told me she was working a double at the hospital. I didn't say anything about it. I photographed the statement with my phone, the way you document something you weren't ready to use yet, and put the paper back in the stack exactly where I'd found it. I told myself I was being careful, thorough, that I needed more than a hunch and an old message thread before I turned our whole life upside down over something I might still be misreading. That was mostly true. What was also true, and harder to admit, was that some part of me was still hoping I'd find an explanation that made all of it make sense in a way that didn't end our marriage. Even as another part of me had already started making a different kind of plan, one I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. Whitney and I had a good night that week, too. I want to say that, because it's true, and because it's part of what made everything so hard to hold on to at once. Friday evening, Nora asleep, the 2 of us on the couch with a movie neither of us watched, Whitney's head on my shoulder, her hand finding mine the way it had 1,000 times over 7 years. For 20 minutes, I let myself believe none of the rest of it was real. She fell asleep before the movie ended. I sat there a long time after, not moving, watching her breathe, feeling something in my chest that wasn't quite grief yet, but was getting close. That Friday night was the last good one we had before things started moving faster than I was ready for. And if I'd known that at the time, I might have let myself enjoy it instead of spending the whole evening waiting for it to end. The wine bar charge sat in my phone for 2 weeks before I did anything about it, and when I finally did something, it wasn't what I expected of myself. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon, told myself I just wanted to see the place, nothing more. It was smaller than I'd pictured, exposed brick, a chalkboard menu, the kind of spot people go to be seen together, not to hide. I asked the bartender, casual as I could manage, if he remembered a woman matching Whitney's description on that Thursday. He didn't, not specifically, but he did remember something else when I mentioned Tyler's name, half guessing. Brent. Yeah, he's a regular. Comes in most Thursdays with someone. He caught himself then, like he'd said more than he should have to a stranger. Sorry, man, I don't really. I shouldn't be talking about customers. I thanked him and left before he could ask why I was asking. That should have been enough. It wasn't, not in the way I needed it to be. A bartender's half memory wasn't proof, and some cold, careful part of me knew I needed something I couldn't argue myself out of later. The next contradiction came from Whitney herself, and it nearly sent me chasing the wrong thing entirely. She mentioned, offhand, that she and Courtney were doing a spa weekend in McCall that Saturday. Just us. We haven't had a real girls' trip in years, and something about the way she said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, made me suspect Courtney wasn't going at all. I nearly convinced myself Whitney was traveling alone to meet Tyler somewhere, that the whole spa weekend story was a cover invented on the spot. I was wrong. I found that out Friday night when Courtney's husband, Dave, texted me completely by accident, a message clearly meant for someone else, asking if I wanted to grab a beer while the girls are off doing their thing this weekend. Courtney was going. The trip was real. I'd built an entire false suspicion out of nothing but my own dread, and it embarrassed me enough that I nearly stopped watching altogether. I didn't stop. I just recalibrated. I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part most people skip when they tell a story like this. The part where you're wrong about something, and it costs you a little bit of your own confidence in what you think you know. If you've ever built a whole theory out of half a fact, and then watched it collapse, you understand exactly how small that made me feel that weekend. I felt foolish for suspecting the wrong thing. I didn't feel foolish for suspecting something. Whitney texted from McCall Saturday night, a photo of her and Courtney at dinner, both of them laughing, wine glasses raised. It looked real because it was real. What I didn't know, what she told me much later, long after all of this had already played out, was what happened after that photo was taken. I remember sitting at that dinner table in McCall, looking at Courtney across from me, and for a second I almost told her I wanted to stop. Actually stop, not just say it and mean it for a week. I'd said it to myself so many times by then that the words barely meant anything anymore. But that night felt different. Maybe because I was somewhere that had nothing to do with him, somewhere that was just supposed to be about my friend and me. Courtney asked if I was okay, and I almost told her everything I was feeling instead of the version I usually gave her. I opened my mouth, and then my phone buzzed on the table, his name on the screen, and I picked it up before I even decided to, and whatever I was about to say to her just went away. I told her it was nothing. She didn't believe me. She never said so, but I could tell. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Nora's birthday party was that following weekend, and it became, without my planning it that way, the place where two threads of this collided. Tyler didn't come. I want to be clear about that. Whatever Nora had overheard weeks earlier didn't mean he showed up at our house. But Courtney did, and halfway through the party, while Whitney was inside cutting the cake, Courtney found me alone by the cooler and said something that stopped me cold. "You seem different lately," she said, not quite looking at me. "Everything okay with you too?" I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, a full 3 seconds, long enough that I counted them, and said, "Nothing. Forget it. Just checking on my friend's husband." She smiled and walked back inside before I could ask anything else. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the first time anyone in this whole tangled arrangement had looked at me directly and let something almost slip, and I spent the rest of that party turning the moment over in my head, trying to decide whether Courtney was warning me or testing me, guilty about her own silence or just genuinely worried about her friend's marriage. I still don't fully know the answer to that. What I do know is that 2 days after the party, I finally called a locksmith. Not because I'd made any final decision yet, but because some part of me had started making decisions I hadn't consciously agreed to. Decisions that were quietly, methodically, preparing for something I wasn't ready to name out loud. I told myself it was just an estimate. I told myself a lot of things that month. What I didn't tell myself, what I couldn't have known yet, was that the locksmith's quote sitting in my email inbox was about to collide with something Whitney was planning on her own end, something that would bring both of our secrets into the same room a lot sooner than either of us expected. The locksmith's quote sat in my inbox for 11 days before I acted on it. 11 days of watching Whitney move through our house like nothing was wrong, because as far as she knew, nothing was. I found the real proof by accident, the way most of it had come to me. Whitney left her old phone charging in the kitchen. She'd upgraded months earlier but kept the backup around for Nora's apps, and it buzzed while she was in the shower. A calendar reminder. Tyler, Thursday 6 p.m., usual spot. I didn't touch it. I photographed the screen and put the phone back exactly where it had been, cord still plugged in the same way, angle untouched. That single detail did something the wine bar receipt and the bartender's half-memory never had. It gave me a place and a time. I went Thursday. I sat in my car across the street from a building I didn't recognize. Not the wine bar this time. An apartment complex 2 miles from the hospital. And at 6:04 I watched Whitney's car pull into the visitor lot. She didn't look around before she went in. She didn't have to. She'd stopped being careful weeks ago, I realized, in a way that told me something I hadn't let myself consider before. She wasn't scared of getting caught anymore. Some part of her had stopped believing it mattered. I sat there for 40 minutes. I didn't go in. I didn't call her. I just watched the door, and something in my chest sat heavy the whole time, a kind of pressure I hadn't felt since college finals, except this didn't go away when I stood up and walked around. I drove home before she did. I made dinner. I put Nora to bed. When Whitney walked in an hour later, hair slightly damp, saying she'd stayed late to help a co-worker with a med card audit, I said, sounds like a long one, and meant nothing by my voice at all. She had no idea what I just watched. That gap, between what she thought I knew and what I actually knew, had become the only thing keeping me steady. Courtney called me 2 days later. Not Whitney. Me. She said she needed to tell me something and hated herself for waiting this long. I sat in my car in the office parking garage and listened to my wife's best friend of a decade tell me, in a voice that kept catching, that she'd known about Tyler since spring, that she'd covered for 2 of the girls' nights, that she'd told Whitney, more than once, to stop, and Whitney had told her it wasn't her business. Why now, I said. Not really a question. Because Dave found out I knew. And he asked me how I could look you in the eye at Nora's party. A pause. I couldn't answer him. I thanked her. I didn't yell. I hung up and sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel, not driving anywhere. That was the moment the subplot I'd been half-tracking for months finally connected to the one that mattered. Courtney hadn't just known. She'd been managing it, smoothing it, buying Whitney time the same way I'd been buying myself time by not confronting her. 2 people protecting the same lie from opposite directions, both telling themselves they were being loyal. I didn't tell Whitney that Courtney had called. I didn't tell anyone. I put that piece where I put everything else, filed, dated, not yet used. She told me, much later, what was happening on her end that same week. Tyler had started pushing. Not asking anymore, pushing. He wanted me to actually leave, stop stringing this along in pieces, said he was done being someone's secret. I remember standing in my car outside his building, not going in yet, running through what my life would look like if I actually did what he wanted. Nora's face was the only thing that stopped me. I told him I needed more time. He said I'd been saying that for 6 months. He wasn't wrong. I drove home that night and Brady asked how work was, and I said fine. And some part of me wanted so badly for him to just already know, so I wouldn't have to be the one to say it. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Not about Tyler's ultimatum, not about how close she'd come to making a decision that would have changed everything before I ever had the chance to. The apartment. The photograph of the calendar reminder. Courtney's call. I had 3 separate pieces now, each one confirming the last. None of them contradicted by anything Whitney had told me directly. I still didn't confront her. I called the locksmith back instead and scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday, a day I knew, from the calendar reminder I'd photographed, that Whitney would be at the usual spot, with Tyler for at least 2 hours. I told myself, driving home that night, that I was still deciding, that I could cancel the locksmith, that there was still a version of this where I sat Whitney down, showed her what I had, and asked her to choose our marriage in a way that meant something. I didn't believe myself, not really. Some decision had already been made somewhere underneath the part of me that kept pretending to weigh it. I came close to telling her that Friday night, actually. We were doing dishes, Nora asleep upstairs, and Whitney said something about how quiet I'd been lately. Was everything okay? I stood there with a plate in my hand and almost said all of it. The apartment, the calendar, Courtney's call, right there at the sink, in the most ordinary moment of our week. I didn't. I said I was just tired. She nodded. Let it go, the way we'd both been letting things go for months. That was the moment I could have changed how this ended. I chose not to, and it cost me something I still think about. The chance to have this conversation on my terms, calm, before either of us had done anything that couldn't be walked back. By Tuesday morning, the locksmith was confirmed. Whitney's afternoon plans with Tyler were exactly where I expected them to be, and I understood, driving Nora to preschool, that whatever came next wasn't going to happen in a conversation at the kitchen sink anymore. The locksmith came at 9, changed both the front and back deadbolts, and left by 10:15. I put Whitney's old key on the counter next to a folder I'd been assembling for 3 weeks. The calendar screenshot, the wine bar statement, a printout of the apartment complex's visitor log I'd gotten from a friend who worked property management, and a single photograph I'd taken myself, from my car, of her walking into that building at 6:04 on a Thursday. Then I picked up Nora from preschool, took her to my brother's for the afternoon, and came home to wait. Whitney texted around 5. Running a little late, be home by 7. I didn't answer. At 7:20, I heard her key not work in the front door. 3 tries, the distinct sound of metal not finding its groove, and then her knock. I opened it. She stood on the porch, confused first, then something sharper. Why doesn't my key work? Come in, I said. Sit down. She walked in already talking, already building whatever version of the evening she'd expected to have. Brady, what is going on? Did something happen with the locks? Is Nora? Nora's fine. She's at Marcus's. I set the folder on the table and slid it toward her, closed. Sit down. She sat. She didn't open it right away. I know about Tyler, I said. I know about the apartment. I know Courtney's known since spring. Her face did 3 things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, then something like calculation, then a kind of flatness settling over all of it, like a door closing behind her eyes. It's not what you think. Open the folder. She opened it. I watched her go through each page slowly. The calendar screenshot first, then the wine bar statement, then the photograph, and I watched her build a response with each one, adjusting in real time. This doesn't prove anything, she said, tapping the photograph. I go to that building for a coworker sometimes. We carpool. Whitney. It's not what it looks like. Whitney. I said her name again, quieter, and something about that made her stop. Courtney called me. Not to gossip. Because her husband asked her how she could look me in the eye at Nora's birthday party, and she didn't have an answer for him. She's known since spring. That landed differently than the folder had. Her shoulders dropped an inch. Courtney had no right. She had every right. She's been carrying your secret for months, so you didn't have to carry it alone. That's not betrayal, Whitney. That's what you asked of her. She sat with that for a second, jaw tight, and I watched her try one more version. It's not serious. We're old friends, we reconnected. It got complicated, but it's not what you're making it into. You told him it wasn't a secret that mattered. That's not what he told Courtney. Her head came up fast. What? He's been pushing you to leave. For months. You told him you needed more time. I let that sit a beat. You didn't tell me that part yourself. I already knew it. I watched something in her collapse. Not loudly, not with tears yet, just a kind of structural give. The same way a wall looks right before it isn't standing anymore. How long have you known? She said. Not a challenge. Just quiet. Long enough to change the locks instead of asking you first. She flinched at that, harder than at anything else I'd said. I think some part of her had expected to still have room to negotiate, to manage this the way she'd been managing everything for months, and the locks told her, more clearly than any folder could, that the negotiation had already happened without her. Say something real, I said. Not a version. The actual thing. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, smaller, less composed, like whatever performance she'd walked in with had finally run out. It started at the reunion thing, the Facebook group. He messaged me first. Just memories, stupid college stuff. I told myself it was nothing. Then we started talking more, and I told myself that was nothing too. Then we met for coffee in March, and I told Courtney it was just catching up, and some part of me knew that was already a lie the second I said it, because I didn't tell you I was going. She stopped. Started again. After that it was, I don't know, easier than it should have been. Every time I told myself it was the last time, I meant it when I said it. I really did. And then a week would pass, and I'd find a reason. I got good at the reasons. She looked down at her hands. I couldn't look at Nora's drawings on the fridge some mornings. There's one where she drew our family, and I'd stand there making her breakfast and just not look at it. I hated who I'd become, and I kept becoming her anyway. Did you ever try to stop? Twice. Her voice caught. Once after McCall. I almost told Courtney everything at dinner, and then he texted and I picked up instead. And 3 weeks ago, when he told me he was done waiting, done being a secret, I told him I needed more time. That wasn't me trying to end it, Brady. I think some part of me was hoping you'd find out before I had to choose. So I wouldn't have to be the one who said it. I didn't say anything for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Nora's nightlight glowing faintly down the hall, even though she wasn't home, a habit neither of us had broken. You wanted me to catch you, I said finally, instead of telling me yourself. She didn't answer that. I don't think she had an answer. I'm not asking you to leave tonight, I said, standing up. But you're not staying here tonight either. There's a bag by the door with a few things. You'll need to make other arrangements. We'll talk about Nora tomorrow, through my brother, not through texts at midnight. Brady, I changed the locks this morning, I said, because some part of me had already decided this before I let the rest of me catch up. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not sorry either. She looked at the folder, then at me, then at the door, like she was trying to find some version of the next 30 seconds where any of it went differently. There wasn't one. She picked up the bag on her way out. She didn't say anything else. The door closed behind her, and I stood in the kitchen a long time afterward, listening to her car start in the driveway, then pull away, the sound fading until the house was just quiet in the ordinary way it always was at that hour. Except that it wasn't ordinary at all, and some part of me understood, standing there, that the version of my life I'd been protecting for months by not asking questions had ended the moment I finally stopped protecting it. The divorce filing went in 3 weeks later. Idaho doesn't require much drama for an uncontested split. Whitney didn't contest anything, not the house, not the timeline, not the custody arrangement my lawyer proposed. I got Nora during the week. She got weekends and Wednesdays. It took 4 months to finalize, most of it paperwork, none of it the screaming match people expect when they hear a word like affair. Tyler lasted 7 weeks past the day I found out. Whitney told me this later, not because I asked, but because Courtney mentioned it, and I didn't stop her. Once the secrecy was gone, once it wasn't stolen time in an apartment 2 miles from the hospital anymore, once it was custody schedules and a kid asking why mommy didn't live at the house anymore, he stopped answering as fast. Then he stopped answering at all. Whatever they'd had needed to be hidden to survive. Out in the open, it didn't have anything left to run on. Whitney moved into a 1-bedroom across town. She kept her job. She lost something harder to name. The easy trust of people who'd known her for years and now measured their sentences around her a little more carefully. Courtney kept seeing her, but differently. The way you keep a friendship after you've stopped fully believing in the version of the person you used to know. She asked to come back in October, 5 months after the locks changed. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table, no folder between us this time, and said she'd been seeing someone, a therapist, not another man, and that she understood now what she'd done, not just to me, but to the version of herself she used to recognize in the mirror. She wasn't performing when she said it. I could tell the difference by then. I told her I believed her. I also told her the door wasn't reopening. Not out of anger. That had mostly burned down to something quieter by then. But because I'd learned something about myself over those 5 months that I wasn't willing to unlearn. I could forgive her and still not want my life back the way it had been. She nodded. She didn't argue. I think some part of her had already known what I'd say before she asked. The quiet scene came a few weeks after that, on a Wednesday evening when Whitney dropped Nora off after their regular dinner. Nora ran inside first, already talking about a school project, and Whitney lingered on the porch for a second, keys in hand. New keys, hers now, to her own apartment. "I used to think the locks were the cruelest thing you ever did to me," she said. "I know. I don't think that anymore." She looked past me, into the house, at Nora's backpack already dropped in the hallway the way it always was. "I think it was the moment you finally stopped waiting for me to decide something for both of us." I didn't have anything clever to say back to that. "Good night, Whitney." "Good night, Brady." She turned and walked to her car. I stood in the doorway and watched her taillights pull out of the driveway, and then I closed the door, turned the new lock, the one that had never once failed to catch, the one that fit the only key I carried now, and went inside to help Nora with her project. That's my story. A locksmith's van in the driveway, a folder that stayed closed longer than it should have, a key that stopped working before either of us said a word about why. I've had some time to sit with all of it since, and a few things stayed with me that I didn't expect to learn from a year like that one. I used to think staying quiet was a kind of loyalty to the marriage, to the version of us I wanted to still be true. It wasn't loyalty. It was fear wearing a patient face. There's also this. Gathering proof in silence for months felt like control at the time, but really it was just another way of avoiding the conversation that actually needed to happen. And the last one is the one that still catches me sometimes. Trusting someone completely isn't the same thing as paying attention to them, and I'd spent years thinking those were the same skill. I still think about that key sitting on the counter the night everything came apart. How small an object it was to carry that much weight. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If any part of it found something familiar in your own life, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.